21. What's wrong, Kira? Tell me. Thomas was following her up the stairs. The gathering had finally ended. Jo had been led away by tenders, but not before she had had an exhilarating moment of triumph. At the end of the long afternoon, when the audience stood and sang, in chorus with the singer, the magnificent Amen, so be it, that always formed the song's conclusion, the singer himself beckoned to little Jo. Though the tyke had wriggled and dozed during the long hours, now she looked up at him with eagerness, and when it was clear that he was summoning her to join him, she scrambled down from her chair and ran enthusiastically to the stage. She stood by his side and beamed with satisfaction, waving one small arm in the air, while the people, released now from their solemnity, whistled and stamped their feet in appreciation. Kira, watching, remained motionless and silent, overwhelmed with her new knowledge and a heavy feeling that combined dread and terrible sorrow. That fear and sadness stayed with her as she limped laboriously upstairs, and Thomas urged her to explain what was wrong. She took a deep breath and prepared herself to tell him what she knew. But at the top of the staircase, they were interrupted by the sight of Matt in the corridor outside Kira's open door. He was grinning broadly and dancing impatiently from foot to foot. "It's here," Matt called. "The big giftie." Kira entered the room and stopped just inside the door. She stared curiously at the stranger, who sat slumped wearily in her chair. She could tell from his long legs that the man was quite tall. There was gray in his hair, though he was not old. 3 syllables, she thought, trying to categorize him in some way that would perhaps explain his presence. Yes, 3 syllables, about the same as Jameson, maybe the age of her mother's brother, she decided. She nudged Thomas. "Look," she whispered, indicating the color of the man's loose shirt. "Blue." The intruder stood and turned toward her at the sound of her voice and at the continued burst of Matt's barely contained excitement. Kira wondered briefly why he had not risen when she entered. It would have been the expected gesture for even the most inconsiderate or hostile stranger. And this man appeared to be both friendly and courteous. He was smiling slightly, but now she could see, to her distress, that he was blind. Scars crossed and disfigured his face with jagged lines across his forehead and down the length of one cheek, and his eyes were opaque and unseeing. She had never seen anyone with destroyed vision before, though she had heard of such things happening through accident or disease, but damaged people were useless. They were always taken to the field. Why was this sightless man alive? When had Matt found him? And why was he here? Matt was still prancing about with anticipation. "I brung him," he announced gleefully. He touched the man's hand and demanded confirmation. "I brung you, didn't I?" "You did," the man said, and his voice was affectionate toward the tyke. "You were a wonderful guide. You brought me almost all the way." "I brung him all the way from yonder," Matt said, turning to Kira and Thomas. "But then, at the end, he wanted to feel his way alone. I be telling him he can keep Ranchi for a helper, but he want to do it all alone. So he give me the scrap for the first giftie, see?" Matt pulled at the man's shirt and showed Kira the hem at the back from which he had torn the piece of cloth. "I'm sorry," Kira said politely to the man. She felt awkward and uncertain in his presence. "Your shirt is ruined." "I have others," the man said with a smile. "He wanted so badly to show you the gift, and I felt the need to find my way by myself. I have been here before, but it was a long time ago." And look, Matt was like a toddler or a puppy, dashing about in excitement. He picked up a bag from the floor beside the chair and pulled its drawstring open. "Now we'll be needing some water," he said, lifting several wilted plants out gently. "But these be all right. They be perking up when we give them a drinky. But you never be guessing what." Now he turned to the blind man again and tugged at his sleeve to be certain he was paying attention. "What?" The man seemed amused. She got water right here. You're probably thinking we gotta take these plants to the river. But right here, if I open this door, she got water that squirts out. He pranced to the door and opened it. Take the plants then, Matt, the man suggested, and give them their drink. He turned toward Kira, and he could tell that he knew how to feel her presence in his darkness. It's woad we've brought you, he explained. It's the plant that my people use to make blue dye. Your beautiful shirt, she murmured, and he smiled again. Matt told me that it's the same shade as the sky on a sunny summer start morning, he said. Kira agreed. Yes, she said. That's it, exactly. Much the same as the blossom on a morning glory vine, I would think, the man said. Yes, that's true, but how? I haven't always been sightless. I remember those things. They could hear the sound of running water. Matt, don't drown them, the man called. It would be a very long trip back to get more. He turned back to Kira. I would be happy to bring more, of course, but I think you won't need that. Please, Kira said. Sit down, and we'll have a meal sent up. It's time for dinner anyway. Even in her confusion, she tried to remember the basic courtesies. The man had brought her a gift of great value. Why he had done it, she couldn't begin to comprehend, nor how hard it must have been to come a great distance with no eyes and no guide but a lively boy and a bent-tailed dog. And at the last of the journey, when Matt had run ahead with his treasured scrap of blue, the blind man had come alone. How was it possible? I'll call the tenders and tell them, Thomas said. The man looked startled and concerned. Who's that? He asked, hearing Thomas's voice for the first time. I live down the hall, Thomas explained. I carved the singer's staff while Kira did the robe. Maybe you don't understand about the gathering, but it's just ended, and it's a really important. I know about that, the man said. I know all about it. Please don't call for food, he added firmly. No one must know that I'm here. Food? Matt asked, emerging from the bathroom. I'll have them bring our dinners to my room down the hall, and no one will know, Thomas suggested. We'll all share it. There's always more than enough. Kira nodded agreement, and Thomas left the room to summon the tenders. Matt scampered behind him, alert to the prospect of food. Now, Kira found herself alone with the stranger in the blue shirt. She could tell from his posture that he was very tired. She sat down, facing him, on the edge of the bed, and sought in her mind the right things to say to him, the right questions to ask. Matt's a good boy, she said after a moment's silence, but he forgets some important things in his excitement. He didn't tell you my name. I'm Kira. The blind man nodded. I know. He told me all about you. She waited. Finally, into the quiet, she said, He didn't tell me who you are. The man stared with his unseeing eyes into the room beyond the place where Kira sat. He began to speak, faltered, took a breath, then stopped. It's beginning to get dark, he said finally. I'm facing the window, and I can't feel the change in daylight. Yes, it's how I found my way here after Matt left me at the edge of the village. We had planned to wait and arrive at night in the darkness, but there were no people about, so it was safe for us to enter in daylight. Matt realized it was the day of the gathering. Yes, Kira said. It began very early in the morning. He is not going to answer my question, she thought. I remember the gatherings, and I remembered the path. The trees have grown, of course, but I could feel the shadows. I could feel my way along the center of the path by the way the light fell. He smiled wearily. I could smell the butcher's hut. Kira nodded and chuckled. And when I passed the weaving shed, I could smell the fabrics folded there, and even the wood of the looms. If the women had been at work, I would have recognized the sounds. With his tongue against the roof of his mouth, he made the repetitive muted clacking sound of the shuttle, and then the whisper of the threads turning into cloth. And so I made my way here all alone. Matt met me then and brought me to your room. Kira waited. Then she asked, "Why?" As she watched, he touched his own face. He ran his hand over the scars, feeling the edges. Then he followed his jagged skin down the side of his own cheek, along his neck. Finally, he reached into his blue shirt and pulled forward the leather thong that hung there. As he held it in his hand, she saw the polished half-rock that matched her own. "Kira," he said, but he did not need to tell her now, because she knew. "My name is Christopher. I'm your father." In shock, she stared at him. She watched his ruined eyes and saw that they were able still to weep. 22. In some hidden place to which Matt had led him in the night, her father slept, but before he had left her in order to sleep, he had told her his story. "No, it was not beast," he said, in reply to her first questions. "It was man." "There are no beasts out there," he said. His voice was as certain as Annabella's had been. "There be no beasts." "But—" Kira began to interrupt, to tell her father what Jamieson had told her. "I saw your father taken by beasts," Jamieson had said, but she waited and continued to listen. "Oh, there are wild creatures in the forest, of course. He hunted them for food. We still do. Deer, squirrel, rabbit," he sighed. It was a large hunt that day. The men had gathered for the distribution of weapons. I had a spear and a sack of food. Katrina had prepared food for me. She always did. "Yes, I know," Kira whispered. He seemed not to hear her. With his blank eyes, he seemed to be looking backward in time. "She was expecting a child," he said, smiling. He gestured with his hand, making a curve in the air above his own belly. In a dreamlike way, Kira felt herself small inside the curve made by his arched fingers, inside the memory of her mother. We went in the usual way, together at first, in groups, separating into pairs, and eventually finding ourselves alone as we followed tracks where sounds deeper into the forest. "Were you frightened?" Kira asked. He shook himself loose from the slow, measured speech of his memory and smiled. "No, no, there was no danger. I was an accomplished hunter, one of the best. I was never frightened in the forest." Then his brow furrowed. "I should have been wary, though. I knew that I had enemies. There were jealousies always, and there were rivals. It was a way of life here. Perhaps it still is." Kira nodded. Then she remembered that he couldn't see her acknowledgement. "Yes," she told him, "it still is." "I was soon to be appointed to the Council of Guardians," he went on. "It was a job with great power. Others wanted the post. I suppose it was that. Who knows? There was always hostility here, harsh words. I haven't thought about it in a long time, but now I recall the arguments and anger. Even that morning, when the weapons were assigned," Kira told him. "It happens again recently, at the beginning of a hunt. I saw it. Fights and arguing. It's always that way. It's the way of man." He shrugged. "So it hasn't changed." "How could it change? It's the way it is. It's what tigers are taught, to grab and shove. It's the only way people can get what they want. I would have been taught the way too, but for my leg," Kira said. "Your leg?" He didn't know. How could he? Now she felt embarrassed, having to tell him. "It's twisted. I was born that way. They wanted to take me to the field, but my mother said no." She defied them? Katrina? His face lit and he smiled. And she won. Her father was still alive, and he was a person of great importance, she told me. And so they let her keep me. They probably thought I would die anyway. But you were strong. Yes, Mother said pain made me strong. Telling him she was no longer embarrassed, but proud, and she wanted him to be proud too. He reached out and she took his hand. She wanted him to go on, She needed to know what had happened. She waited. I don't know for certain who he was, he explained when he continued. I can guess, of course. I knew he was bitterly envious. Apparently, he approached silently behind me, and as I waited there, watching for the deer I'd been stalking, he attacked me. First with the club to my head, so that I was stunned and dazed, and then with his knife he left me for dead. But you lived. You were strong. Kira squeezed his hand. I woke in the field. I suppose draggers had taken me there and left me, as they do. You've been to that field? Kira nodded, then remembered his blindness again and said it aloud. Yes. She would have told him when and why, but not yet. I would have died there, as I was supposed to. I couldn't move, couldn't see. I was dazed in great pain. I wanted to die. But that night, he went on, strangers came to the field. I thought at first that it was diggers. I tried to tell him that I was still alive, but when they spoke, it was with the voice of strangers. They used our language, but with a different lilt, a slight change of cadence. Even as desperately wounded as I was, I could hear the difference, and their voices were soothing, gentle. They held something to my mouth, a drink made of herbs. It dulled my pain and made me sleepy. They placed me on a carrying litter they had made of thick branches. Who were they? Kira asked, fascinated, unable to keep from interrupting. I didn't know. I couldn't see them. My eyes were destroyed, and I was almost delirious with pain, but I could hear their comforting voices. So I drank the liquid and gave myself up to their care. Kira was astonished. In her entire lifetime in the village, she had never encountered a single person who would have done such a thing. She knew no one who would be willing to soothe or comfort or aid a grievously wounded being, or who would know how. Except Matt, she thought, remembering how the boy had nursed his little damaged dog back to life. They carried me a very great distance through the forest, her father went on. It took several days. I woke and slept and woke again. Each time I woke, they talked to me, cleaned me, gave me water to drink, and more of the drug to ease my pain. Everything was blurred. I didn't remember what had happened or why, but they healed me as much as I could be healed, and they told me the truth. I would never see again, but they told me also that they would help me to make a life without sight. But who were they? Kira asked again. Who are they, you should say, he told her gently, because they still exist, and I am one of them now. They were just people, but they are people like me who were damaged, who had been left to die, who had been taken our village to the field. Her father smiled. Not only from here, there are other places. They had come from all over, those who had been wounded, sometimes not just in body, but in other ways as well. Some traveled very long distances. It's astounding to hear of the difficult journeys. And those who had reached this place where I found myself, they had formed their own community, my community now, too. Kira remembered what Matt had described, a place where broken people lived. They help each other, her father explained simply. We help each other. Those who can see, they guide me. I am never without helping eyes. Those who can't walk, they are carried. Kira unconsciously rubbed her own damaged leg. There is always someone to lean on, he told her, or a pair of strong hands for those who have none. The village of the healing has existed for a long time, he explained. Wounded people still come, but now it is beginning to change, because children have been born there and are growing up, so we have strong, healthy young people among us, and we have others who have found us and stayed because they wanted to share our way of life. Kira was trying to picture it. So it is a village, like this one? Much the same. We have gardens, houses, families, but it is much quieter than this village. There is no arguing. People share what they have and help each other. Babies rarely cry. Children are cherished. Kira looked at the stone pendant that rested against his blue shirt. She touched her own matching one. Do you have a family there? She asked hesitantly. The whole village is like a family to me, Kira, he replied. But I have no wife, no child. Is that what you mean? Yes. I left my family here, Katrina and the child to come. He smiled. You. She knew she must tell him now. Katrina, she began. I know, your mother is dead, Matt told me. Kira nodded, and for the first time in many months she began to cry for her own loss. She had not wept when her mother died. She had willed herself to be strong then, to decide what to do and to do it. Now hot tears stained her face and she covered it with her hands. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed. Her father opened his arms, offering her an embrace, but she turned from him. Why didn't you come back? She asked finally, choking on the words as she tried to stop crying. Looking out through the shield she had made with her hands over her eyes, she could see that the question pained him. For a very long time, he said at last, I remembered nothing. The blows to my head had been intended to kill me, though they failed, but they took my memory. Who I was, why I was there, my wife, my home, I knew nothing of any of it. Then, very slowly, as I healed, it began to come back. I remembered small things of the past, your mother's voice, a song she sang. Night comes and colors fade away. Night fades, for blue can never stay. Startled by the familiar lullaby, Kira murmured the words with him. Yes, she whispered, I remember it too. Then, very gradually, it all came back to me. But I could not return. I didn't know how to find the way. I was blind and weakened. And if I did find a way back, it would be to meet my death. The ones who wanted me to die were still here. Finally, he explained, I simply stayed. I mourned my losses. But I stayed and made a life there, without your mother, without you. And then he went on, his expression lightening. After so many years had gone by, the boy appeared. He was exhausted when he arrived and hungry. He's always hungry, Kira said, smiling slightly. He said he had come all the way because he had heard that he had blue. He wanted blue for his special friend, who had learned to make all the other colors. When he told me about you, Kira, I knew you must be my daughter. I knew I must let him lead me back. He stretched slightly and yawned. The boy will find me a safe place to sleep when he returns. Kira took his hand and held it. There were scars even there, she saw. Father, she said, feeling her way uncertainly with the words she had never used before. They won't hurt you now. No, I'll be safely hidden, and after I'm rested, we will sleep away, you and I. The boy will help us pack food for the journey. You will be my eyes on the way home, and I will be the strong legs you lean on. No, Father, Kira said, excited now. Look! She waved her arm, indicating the comfortable room. Then she paused, embarrassed. I'm sorry. I know you can't really look, but you can feel how comfortable it is. There are other rooms like it along the hall, all of them empty except the ones where Thomas and I live. One can be readied for you. He was shaking his head. No, he said. You don't understand, Father, because you've not been here, but I have a special role in the village, and because of it, I have a special friend on the Council of Guardians. He saved my life, and he looks after me. Oh, it's too much to explain, and I know you're tired, but Father, not very long ago, I was in great danger. Someone named Vendera wanted me to be put to the field. There was a trial, and Vendera, I remember her. That's the scarred woman? Yes, that's the one, Kira acknowledged. It was a terrible thing, her injury. I remember when it happened. She blamed her child. He slipped on wet rocks and grabbed her skirt so that she fell and gashed her chin and neck on a sharp rock. But I thought, He was only a small tyke, but she blamed him. Later, when he died from the oleander, there were questions. Some people suspected. He paused and sighed, but there was no proof of her guilt. She's a cruel woman, though, Kira's father said. You say she turned on you? And there was a trial? Yes, but I was allowed to stay. I was even given an honored place. I had a defender, a guardian named Jameson, and now he looks after me, father, and supervises my work. I know he'll find a place for you. Happily, Kira squeezed her father's hand, thinking of the future they would have together. But it was as if the air in the room shifted. Lines in her father's face tightened. The hand that she held stiffened and withdrew from hers. Your defender, Jameson? Her father touched his own scarred face again. Yes, he tried to find a place for me before. Jameson is the one who tried to kill me. 23. Alone in the dim pre-dawn moonlight of not yet morning, Kira went down to the dyer's garden that had been so carefully created for her. There, gently patting earth around the moist roots, she planted the woad. Gather fresh leaves from first year's growth of woad. She repeated the words that Annabella had said, and soft rainwater that makes the blue. She carried water from a container in the shed and soaked the soil around the fragile plant. It would be a long time until the first year's growth. She would not be here to gather those leaves. When the plants were watered, she sat alone, knees to chin, and rocked herself back and forth as the sun began to rise. A faint pink stain creeping up the eastern rim of the sky. The village was still silent. She tried to put it all together in her mind to make some sense of it. But there was no sense, no meaning at all. Her mother's death, a sudden violent, isolated illness, such things were rare. Usually illness struck the village and many were taken. Perhaps her mother had been poisoned? But why? Because they wanted Kira. Why? So that they could capture her gift, her skill with the threads. And Thomas, his parents too, and Joe's? Why? So that all their gifts would be captive. Despairing, Kira stared through the early dawn at the garden. The plants glimmered and shifted in the breeze, some of them still in autumn's dark blue. Now, finally, woad had been added to give her the blue she had yearned for, but someone else would harvest the first leaves. Somewhere nearby, her father slept, gathering strength to return with his newfound daughter to the village where healing people lived in harmony. Together, he and Kira would steal away and leave the only world she had ever known. She looked forward to the journey. She would not miss the squalor and noise they would leave behind. She would long for Matt and his mischief, she thought sadly. And Thomas, so serious and dedicated, she would miss him too. And Joe. She smiled at the thought of the little singer who had waved so proudly to the crowd at the gathering. Thinking of Joe, Kira remembered something. In the confusion and excitement of her father's arrival, it had disappeared from her mind. Now the awareness and the horror came back, and she gasped. The muted clanking sound that had puzzled her during the celebration. She could almost hear it again in her mind, a dragging of metal. She had glimpsed its cause at the beginning of the second half of the song. Then, at the conclusion, after the singer had acknowledged the people's applause, after Joe had scampered happily down from the stage, he moved toward the steps to descend and walk down the aisle. He lifted the rope slightly at the top of the steps, and from her seat at the edge of the stage, Kira saw his feet. They were bare and grotesquely misshapen. His ankles were thickly scarred, more damaged than her father's face. They were caked and scabbed with dried blood. Fresh, bright blood trickled in narrow rivulets across his feet. It all came from the raw, festering skin, infected and dripping, around the metal cuffs with which he was bound. Between the thick ankle cuffs, dragging heavily as he made his way slowly from the stage, was a chain. He lowered the rope then, and she saw nothing more. Perhaps, she thought, she had imagined it, but watching him as he moved, she heard the sound of the scraping chain against the floor, and she could see behind him a smeared, darkened trail of his blood. Recalling it now, Kira knew, suddenly and with clarity, what it all meant. It was so simple. The three of them, the new little singer who would one day take the chained singer's place, Thomas the carver, who with his meticulous tools wrote the history of the world, and she herself, the one who colored that history. They were the artists who could create the future. Kira could feel it in her fingertips, her ability to twist and weave the colors into the scenes of amazing beauty that she had made all alone, before they assigned her work the task of the rope. Thomas had told her that once he too had carved astonishing things into wood that seemed to come alive in his hands, and she could hear the high, haunting melody that the child had sung in her magical voice, solitary in her room, before they had forced her from it and given her their own song to sing. The guardians with their stern faces had no creative power, but they had strength and cunning, and they had found a way to steal and harness other people's powers for their own needs. They were forcing the children to describe the future they wanted, not the one they could be. Kira watched the garden tremble and move as it slept. She saw the newly planted woad settle in, nestled where she had laid it gently beside the yellow bedstraw. Mostly it dies after flowering once, Annabella had said, describing woad. But sometimes you find the small shoot leaves. It was those small living shoots she had planted, and something in Kira's knew, without a doubt, that they would survive. She knew something else as well, and with the realization, she rose from the damp grass to go indoors, to find her father and tell him that she could not be his eyes, that she must stay. Matt was the one who would lead Christopher home. Late at night, they gathered at the edge of the path that led away from the village, the same path that would wind past Annabella's clearing and continue onward for days to the village of the healing people. Matt was prancing about, eager to begin the journey, proud of his role as the leader. Branch, also eager to set off on an adventure, sniffed and wandered here and there. I know you've been missing me horrid, Matt confided, and maybe I'd be gone a long time, because maybe they'd be wanting me to visit. He turned to Christopher. They got plenty of food all the time, for visitors? And doggies? Christopher, smiling, nodded yes. Then Matt took Kira aside to whisper an important secret. I know you can't be getting a hubby because of your horrid gimp, he said in a low, apologetic voice. It's all right, she reassured him. He tugged at her sleeve eagerly. I've been wanting to tell you that them other people, them broken ones, they get married, and I seen a boy there, a two-syllable boy, not even broken, just about the same age as you. I bet you could marry him, Matt announced in a solemn whisper, if you want to. Kira hugged him. Thanks, Matt, she whispered back. I don't want to. His eyes be a very amazing blue, Matt said importantly, as if it might matter. But Kira smiled and shook her head no. Thomas carried the bundle of food they had saved and packed. There, at the beginning of the path, he transferred it to Christopher's strong back. Then the two shook hands. Kira waited silently. Her father understood her decision. You will come when you can, he said to her. Matt will go back and forth. He will be our tie, and one day he will bring you. One day our villages will know each other, Kira assured him. I can feel that already. It was true. She could feel the future through her hands. In the pictures her hands were urging her to make. She could feel the broad, undecorated expanse waiting across the shoulders of the rope. I have a gift for you, her father told her. She looked at him, puzzled. He had come empty-handed and had lived in hiding for the past few days, but now he put something soft into her hand, something that had a quality of comfort. She could sense, but could not see, in the darkness what it was. Threads? She asked. A bundle of threads? Her father smiled. I had time sitting alone while I waited to return, and my hands are very clever because they have learned to do things unseeing. Bit by bit, I unraveled the fabric of my blue shirt, he explained. The boy found me another to wear. I filched it, Matt announced with matter-of-fact pride. So you will have blue threads, her father went on, while you wait for your plans to come to life. Goodbye, Kira whispered and hugged her father. She watched through the darkness as the blind man, the renegade boy, and the bent-tailed dog set off down the path. Then, when she could see them no longer, she turned and walked back to what lay waiting. The blue was gathered in her hand, and she could feel it quiver, as if it had been given breath and was beginning to live.